Sri Lanka's most powerful news brand.
Hello, good evening and welcome to Biz1st Review 360, your weekly roundup of the top business news and developments impacting the Sri Lankan economy. This week was dominated by the visits of the leaders of two so-called Asian tiger economies to Sri Lanka. The visit of the Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong was especially significant as it marked the signing of the first free trade agreement in decades and, according to authorities, the most comprehensive FTA in Sri Lanka's history, the Sri Lanka-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. Where will this free trade agreement take the Sri Lankan economy? We'll be talking to two economists later on in the program. First, a look at this week's top stories.
Hot on the heels of signing a free trade agreement with Singapore, Sri Lanka has agreed to a joint feasibility study with Indonesia on the possibility of a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement. The agreement for a study was reached during Indonesian President Joko Widodo's state visit to Sri Lanka. The joint statement said the two leaders recognized the importance of regional cooperation and integration in Asia and reaffirmed their commitment to deepen and broaden economic collaboration. The statement further said that President Widodo encouraged Sri Lanka to enhance its engagements with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. The two presidents also witnessed the signing of 3 MOUs in the fields of search and rescue, higher education, research and technology, and cooperation against trafficking in narcotic drugs, psychotropic substances, and their chemical precursors.
Responding to concerns over refuse or low-grade tea being exported from Sri Lanka, Minister of Plantation Industries Navin Dissanayake said tough action will be taken against corruption in the tea trade. Dissanayake said the regulator, the Tea Board, was under tremendous pressure and finding it difficult to crack down on corruption given the size of the industry. Minister Dissanayake also said that tea exports from Sri Lanka to China have increased by 30% last year.
And as a policy, I want to, with the government and with the support of the President and the Prime Minister, I want to hit that aspect that impure tea is coming into the market of low-grade quality, being mixed with the other grades and exported. A lot of people are doing it, so I want to hit it hard because I can't tolerate that. I want to clean that as much as I can. I want to, next 1.5 years, as long as I'm in this ministry, I want to clean that up. I don't think I have taken hard decisions on that. Maybe it is my fault also. But this year I want to do what I can to clean the industry up. I was concentrating more on the price, the production, the other issues that came up. We decide issues. We were saddled with a lot of problems. But now I have a very easy. I think this year is going to be easier for me than the other 1.5 years. Tea residue levels, there have been a slight increase in the residue levels, especially for Japanese market, where they have made that percentage higher. The EU standard is 0.05. The Japanese have bought a new residue level to 0.01, which is much higher than the European level. So when the Japanese foreign minister came, I had extensive discussions with them. With him, and he promised to look into this at the highest political level. What we are asking is a grace period of 6 months for us to get our act in order, so that we also can have a better alternative to. So those are the ones that are being used by some elements, because the traditional method of the glyphosate is not there. So this is why I am saying right from the start, I have been wanting a weedicide for the industry. So these are the sub-issues that come up when we do unconventional, unplanned, irregular policy decisions that affect the whole industry. We are going to concentrate on quality and cleanliness in the next year, and if I can leave this ministry as a minister who stood up for the tea industry and who did the best for the tea industry, getting the global campaign off the ground this year, hopefully next couple of months, and then cleaned up the industry, this is all I want. then I can leave the ministry in a very happy note, say that I've done the best for the tea industry.
Megapolis and Western Regional Development Minister Patali Champika Ranawaka said that Golfis Green will be expanded by 30 metres and a new access road built to the Colombo port linking Kolpiti. The new road will be an extension of the Marine Drive. He said President Maithripala Sirisena is likely to vest 20 hectares of the port city project area with the Urban Development Authority in March. The UDA will then be handed over to the China Harbour Engineering Corporation to start construction on the $1 billion Colombo financial city.
එහි ගොඩ කිරීම් කටයුතු වලින් 60%ක් අවසන් කරලා තියෙනවා. ලබන වසර වෙනකොට සියලුම ගොඩ කිරීම් කටයුතු අපි අවසන් කරලා හෙක්ටයාර 269ම අපි විධිමත්ව ගොඩ කිරීම් කටයුතු කරනවා.
China Harbour Engineering Company, which is reclaiming 269 hectares of sea to build the port city, is expected to invest the Marine Drive extension plan with underground access to hotels and other offices along the way.
භූගත ඒ කියන්නේ අන්ඩර්ග්‍රවුන්ඩ් මරයින් ඩ්‍රයිව් එක. එතකොට මරයින් ඩ්‍රයිව් එක දැනට පටන් අරන් තියෙන කොල්ලුපිටියේ ස්ටේෂම ගාවින් ඒ මරයින් ඩ්‍රයිව් එක ගෝල් ෆේස් එක හරහා වරායට එනවා. ඒක තමයි සැලසුම. ඒ සඳහා අපි දැනට මාර්ග සංවර්ධන අධිකාරියත් එක්ක ඒ අදාළ ඉංජිනේරුමේ ඉදිකිරීම් පාරිසරිකමය අධ්‍යයනයන් සිදු කරගෙන යනවා. මේ සඳහා සම්පූර්ණ ආයෝජනය මේ චයිනා හාබර් ආයතනය කරනවා. ඒ අනුව මේ තියෙන මේ හරිය තියෙන මාර්ග තදබදයට යා නොවි ගාලුපාරේ මාර්ග තදබදයට යා නොවි නව මාර්ගයක් කොල්ලුපිටියේ ඉඳන් මෙතනට වරායට විවෘත වෙනවා. ඒ වගේම මේ හරහා අපි මේ තියෙන හැමතෙම ඇක්සස් දෙනවා. ජනාධිපති කාර්යාලයට එතකොට ශැන්ග්‍රීලා හෝටලයට, ගෝල්ෆේස් හෝටලයට, මයුර ෂෙරටන් එකට ඒ ඔක්කොටම අපි ඇක්සස් දෙනවා පොළොව යටින්. ඒ වගේම ගෝල්ෆේස් එක ඔබට පේනවා දික් වෙනවා. ගෝල්ෆේස් එක මේකට යටින් මේක යන්නේ. ඒ නිසා ගෝල්ෆේස් එක තවත් මේ මූද පැත්තට දික් වෙනවා. සාමාන්‍ය මීටර් 30කින් පමණ දික් වෙනවා.
You're watching Biz1st Review 360. On the other side, we'll be joined by two researchers from the Institute of Policy Studies to talk about the Singapore-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement. Welcome back to the program. Free trade agreements, bane or boon? Have the authorities undertaken the latest free trade agreement with Singapore with bona fide intentions, or, as some would have you believe, have economic assassins slipped this past the attention of the public? To discuss the benefits of the Singapore Free Trade Agreement, we're joined by Mr. Janaka Vijayasiri of the Institute of Policy Studies. He's a research fellow at IPS, and also Kitmina Hewage, research officer at IPS, the semi-government think tank. Janaka, Kitmina, thank you very much for coming on Biz1st Review 360. Of course, we still haven't seen the exact contents of the free trade agreement with Singapore, but it's being touted by the government, the Ministry of Development Strategies and International Trade, as the first landmark agreement for Sri Lanka, the first FTA in over a decade, and the first comprehensive FTA in history. Janaka, I'll start with you. Do you agree with that assessment? Is it the most comprehensive FTA that Sri Lanka has signed in our history?
Right. As you rightly pointed out, earlier this week, Sri Lanka signed an FTA with Singapore, and it has been touted as the most comprehensive agreement that we have signed today, which is true given the fact if you look at the agreements that we have signed with countries like India, Pakistan, as well as the rest of South Asia. Under the South Asia Free Trade Agreement, these agreements just looked at trading goods, whereas this particular agreement that we have signed with Singapore is much more comprehensive in scope, covering not only trading goods but also services, investment, government procurement, intellectual property rights, e-commerce, telecom, and so forth. So it's much more broader in scope and much more deeper in terms of the commitments that we have undertaken.
This sounds very interesting. You mentioned government procurement. It's not something that you often hear when it comes to free trade agreements.
Right.
What is the significance of government procurement being featured in this FTA?
This is the first time, in fact, government procurement has been included in a trade agreement that Sri Lanka has signed to date, but it's not new for other countries such as Singapore, which have had this particular chapter in its FTAs. Why is this important for Sri Lanka? in the sense that it will allow businesses of both countries, that is Sri Lankan businesses as well as Singaporean businesses, to bid for government contracts to some extent. And also it will help in terms of ensuring transparency in the procedures in terms when it comes to government procurement. So in that respect, it's a significant move. Even though this is in a somewhat a limited fashion, it's a step in the right direction.
Kitna, there's been a lot of talk in Sri Lanka about the need to sort of dissolve discretionary powers that are vested in various authorities. Free trade agreements have been touted again as one of the solutions to this, to establish a rules-based system where everyone gets a fair go. Does this FTA deliver on that to any extent?
Yes, Nadeem. One of the factors is that Singapore has already opened up most of its tariff lines already to Sri Lankan imports, almost 99%. But still, exports into Singapore are quite low when you consider the gamut of exports that we have. In the same way, Singapore is one of the top investors in Sri Lanka, but it's not to the extent that one would expect given how the economy is growing and how Singapore is looking at countries like Sri Lanka. And one of the reasons is policy instability. One of the reasons is the lack of transparency and so on. So what this agreement does is that, particularly having an investment chapter, creates a framework that provides guarantees to investors from both countries, and also creates the transparency that is vital for investors, because they look at long-term consequences of the actions, and that those long-term guarantees are provided through this investment chapter in the FTA. And in addition to that, one of the most important things is the dispute settlement mechanism included in the investment chapter. The fact that there is now proper means by which both countries, investors as well as the governments in both countries, can go through a dispute settlement mechanism if there were to be issues, rather than going through a prolonged process that might happen and that might increase costs for investors. So the investment chapter in particular is quite vital because it gives those guarantees, provides the transparency, and also sets up a framework in case something goes wrong for disputes to be settled. And that's also an important factor for investors when they consider countries in which they should invest.
Janaka, when you're talking about Sri Lanka's trading partners, you constantly always look towards westwards, the United States, the European Union. What is what is the relationship in terms of trade between Sri Lanka and Singapore right now to warrant having a free trade agreement?
Right. As you rightly pointed out, our traditional export markets have been the US and in the EU, and the government is quite keen to diversify markets as well as products that we export. And in this respect, Singapore being located in the Southeast Asian region, which is the fastest growing region in the world, obviously is an important aspect. Currently, Sri Lanka's trade with Singapore has been increasing in the recent past. It exceeded $1 billion in 2006, and currently last year I think we traded about $1.1 billion in terms of trade with Singapore, and currently Singapore ranks as the 7th largest trading partner of Sri Lanka.
In that respect, $1.1 billion, how much of it accounts for Sri Lankan exports to Singapore?
It amounts to, in terms of the greater amount of trade that we have, it amounts to about 4% of our total trade. It doesn't amount to a lot when you consider the big factor of it.
And will this FTA help boost that? Will it stimulate activity in the export sector here in Sri Lanka? Will it see a more balanced trade gap between the two countries?
I don't think we should expect a significant increase in exports to Singapore because of this FTA alone. Because like I said before, Singapore has already opened up its tariffs. They provide zero tariff for 99% of the imports into the country. So if there were to be an impact, it would have already happened. So I don't think we should look at this FTA in terms of boosting our exports there. But what could happen, I think what will happen, is in terms of bringing in Singaporean investments into the country that in turn generate exports back into Singapore and other markets that Singapore trades with. So it's not necessarily that Sri Lankan exports right now will go to Singapore more, but rather investments, there will be a trade and investment nexus that is created that will increase. And also a sector where Singapore is quite good at and where Sri Lanka is also quite good at is in terms of services. So services trade will also is expected to increase because of this agreement.
Janaka, you mentioned correctly that, ASEAN, the so-called Asian tiger economies, are the fastest growing in the world right now. And the Ministry of Development Strategies and International Trade has said that this FTA with Singapore is part of a broader strategy to link up with the RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. In your opinion, how in your view, how far does this FTA go in accomplishing that strategy, in fitting in with that strategy?
Right. You can think of this as a first step towards engaging with the Southeast Asian region, specifically with the ASEAN countries, Singapore being one of the founding members of ASEAN. As you might be also aware, there have been other countries in the ASEAN which have expressed interest in signing an agreement with Sri Lanka, namely Malaysia, as well as the visiting Indonesian President also has indicated that we should consider sort of looking at the feasibility of signing an FTA with between Indonesia and Sri Lanka. So this FTA can be considered in this broader context of engaging with the Southeast Asian region more, as well as increasing Sri Lanka's standing in the ASEAN region as a move towards sort of engaging with the RCEP as well as in the future.
Janaka, when it comes to free trade agreements, the current government is a great supporter of FTAs with India, with China, the one that has been signed with Singapore. There are other FTAs also that are being explored, and this is being looked at as a very serious avenue to generate serious economic development and growth. Is this strategy? Is this the correct strategy for the country to follow at this juncture?
Obviously, the government is interested in furthering trade liberalization and overhauling our trade policy, and one of the corners of that strategy has been to engage with other countries and deepening our trade with the rest of the world. So in that respect, in this FTA obviously fits into that equation of government's interest in engaging greater engagement with the world, as well as diversifying our markets away from our traditional markets in the US and the West.
Kate Minogue, I'll pose my final question to you because unfortunately we're running short on time. You mentioned that Singapore has already opened up to Sri Lankan. You mentioned 99% of Sri Lankan goods which are exported to Singapore. Would it be correct then to say that the focus of this FTA is more to do with investment and getting in foreign direct investment from Singapore? Absolutely.
That is why the investment chapter is so important, and having that dispute settlement mechanism as well is important. And also things like government procurement, as Janaka mentioned, it creates a sense of transparency, it sends a positive signal to investors, not just in Singapore, but also in other countries who are potentially looking at investing in Sri Lanka, and showing that Sri Lanka is liberalizing and creating a business environment that is conducive to good investment.
Why then do we have all these professional associations or associations of professionals who are so opposed to something that, at least on the surface of it, looks very positive?
When it comes to free trade agreements, it's certain special interest groups that seem to be the loudest. And those are a minority that tend to lose out on trade liberalization. A vast majority, including consumers, are usually silent. A vast majority, such as the investors and people who actually gain through economic growth and economic liberalization tend to be silent in situations like this. So I think, as always, when it comes to trading agreements, you hear counter arguments as well, and those are valid arguments that need to be heard, of course. But in the grand scheme of things, it's important that countries take decisions, economic decisions, that are on net benefit, that net benefit a country, an economy. Of course, there are losers and winners of trade and trade liberalization. It's important that we...
I suppose it's the nature of trade.
Absolutely. And it's important that we kind of reduce the cost of trade, but also kind of make sure that the benefits are far-flung. And in this case, I think that's one of those instances.
Kate Minna, Janaka, thank you very much for coming on Biz1st Review 360 and for sharing your... Welcome back to Biz1st Review 360. What does 2018 hold for Sri Lanka economically? There are a lot more free trade agreements in the pipeline, but where will economic growth lead us? Earlier this week, Central Bank Governor Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy chimed in with the outlook for 2018 and a review of economic progress over 2017.
One can be cautiously satisfied that we've made some progress. I think a reflection of that is the fact that the IMF's Executive Board completed the third review of the extended fund facility. That was completed successfully in December. We are seeing money coming in, foreign money coming into the stock exchange and the government securities market. Fitch and S&P have taken away the negative outlook on their sovereign rating, and we now have a stable outlook. Of course, Moody's still have a negative outlook, but there has been progress in terms of Fitch and S&P. The international sovereign bond that we issued last May, I think it was, which we issued at 620 basis points, has been trading about 60-70 basis points tighter. So these are all indications that there is a degree of confidence that is percolating through as far as the Sri Lankan economy is concerned. Clearly, at the moment, the growth rate is more muted than we would like it to be. We probably end the year with little under 4% growth. In our view, the potential growth rate is about 5.75%. So there is an output gap, which we feel needs to be addressed, and I'll talk to you about some of the things that are being done to do that. But the one thing that has to be avoided at all costs is to try to boost the growth rate by loosening macroeconomic policy in an inappropriate way. This is something we have done again and again in the past. We've artificially boosted growth through inappropriate fiscal and monetary policies, and inevitably there is an overheating of the economy and usually both higher inflation, unsustainable inflation, and a balance of payments crisis. That is the repeating cycle of the Sri Lankan economy, and this time we are determined that we will not go for this sugar high in terms of artificially boosting the growth rate through inappropriate macroeconomic policies. So we want to maintain sound policies and to drive the growth rate through reforms. That's what has to be done, not taking shortcuts which cannot be sustained. As far as fiscal performance is concerned, 2017, there was some slippage in terms of the the overall budget deficit target, which was intended to be 4.7% of GDP. It ended up around 5.2%. For good reasons. Almost the entirety of the slippage was due to flood and even more particularly drought-related expenditures. And in fact, the IMF has accepted that, and the 5.2% of GDP deficit for the for government fiscal operations has something that has been agreed with the IMF. And given the circumstances, it has come out reasonably okay. This year, the target is 4.8%. There are important structural changes that seem to be coming through. One is, for the first time since 1954, we had a primary surplus last year. And this year, for the first time since 1987, we expect a surplus in the current account of the budget. That is, revenue is expected to exceed recurrent expenditure for the first time since 1987. The government is seriously considering strengthening the Fiscal Responsibility Management Act. The Fiscal Responsibility Management Act sets targets for the budget deficit, the overall budget deficit, and for the debt, public debt as a percent of GDP figures. Now, while it was introduced, I think in about 2002 or 2003, pretty much in every year it has been breached because it lacks teeth. So the government is considering giving teeth to the Fiscal Responsibility Management Act by specifying the reasons why you can go outside the target, why the target can be breached. For instance, there could be a major shock to the economy resulting in a severe recession, in which case clearly you will need counter-cyclical fiscal policy which pumps demand in the system to bring about recovery. So you may have to temporarily exceed the target. Two major reforms are due to be undertaken this year, and that is the introduction of a cost-reflective pricing formula for electricity, well, first for fuel and then for electricity. You know, over 90% of the losses of the CPC and CEB are due to the fact that they subsidize fuel and electricity. The government forces them to sell at an administrative price below cost, but yet it doesn't recompense them. It doesn't compensate them for the subsidies. So successive governments have been very clever in parking the budget deficit in the CEB and the CPC, and that subsequently gets transferred onto the balance sheets of the state banks. And it's a highly distortionary thing that has been going on forever. So if we are able to get these cost-reflective pricing formula into place for fuel and energy, it'll again remove a major distortion in the system and significantly improve the macroeconomic stability.
And that's our program for this week. Don't forget to look us up on Facebook. You'll find us at Biz1st Review 360. I'll see you again, same time, same place next week. Until then, good night and good luck.